It's my great honour to introduce the Federal Opposition Leader, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, to address you here. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Albanese.
Well, thanks very much, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and I commit on behalf of my party to the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. And a quick apology too for being a little bit late today. They cancelled my flight, as happens, in the middle of the night with a text message. But I got here because I always show up and I always keep my commitments. The NFF website features a video invitation from Fiona, speaking from her farm on the Liverpool Plains. Fiona explained that the conference would examine serious challenges facing your industry in areas like trade and workforce issues. But she also celebrated the huge opportunities in a reduced emissions future and spoke with a sense of positivity about the need to work hard to maintain strong and vibrant regional communities. Fiona's enthusiasm says everything about the farming sector in this great country and about regional Australia more generally. You are, above all, optimists. You have more than your fair share of challenges. A tough climate, drought, bushfires, floods, you've dealt with them all. The vagaries of commodity prices and international trade arrangements. But as an industry, you meet challenges head on. You just get on with it. You adjust. You look for the positives and you look for the opportunities. In 2022, after 3 years of economic disruption from these natural disasters made worse because of climate change and the COVID pandemic, Australia needs your optimism and positive approach more than ever. We need your engagement on trade and workforce issues, and we need you to lead the way in seizing the huge opportunities that come with the shift to cheap, clean, renewable energy, a shift that the current government has tried to ignore for a decade. These opportunities are vast, value-adding, the rise of new industries driven by cheap renewable energy, new jobs in regional Australia. Labor supports the NFF's ambitious goal to grow the value of Australia's agricultural industry by $100 billion by 2030. And given your great record of innovation and scientific development, starting with the stump jump plough close to 150 years ago, I'd back you to achieve that aim. But your task will be easier with a government that shares your ambition to think ahead. Today I want to talk about Labor's plans to help farmers and regional Australians play their part in building a better future for our nation. Late last year, when I released Labor's Powering Australia plan, I was delighted to hear the NFF join a range of other business organisations to offer their approval, along with the BCA, ACCI and the Australian Industry Group. Labor's plan to embrace the use of cheap renewable energy will create 604,000 jobs. 5 out of every 6 of those will be in regional Australia. We have comprehensive modelling out there for all to see. Our plan will leverage $52 billion of private sector investment. It will cut family power bills by $275 a year by 2025. Now, the current government has ridiculed renewables for years and failed to land an energy policy after more than 20 attempts. They just can't deal with change. It terrifies them. By contrast, Labor sees the shift to renewables as an opportunity for Australia, including, of course, for farm exports. We seek to shape change in the interests of our regions and in our national interest, to imagine a better future and then to work with the community, including with our farmers and agricultural sectors, to make it a reality. The farm sector is already well placed, with Australia blessed to be located in that region of the world that is experiencing the fastest economic growth in human history. We can expect ongoing demand for your bulk commodities as well as opportunities for exporters of agricultural technology and services as countries all across the world grapple with lifting their agricultural productivity. While bulk exports continue to represent a large slice of our agricultural exports, there is increasing excitement about the prospects of greater demand for high technology, value-added food and other agricultural products. And that's where renewable energy kicks in. Renewable energy is not only clean, it's cheap. As its use increases, it will lower the cost profile of manufacturing in this country. This, coupled with increasing mechanisation, changes the equation when it comes to business models for Australian manufacturing. And this makes me extremely optimistic about the future for manufacturing that adds value to our food and fibre exports. I've said many times that Australia should be a nation that makes more things here. It's one of the lessons of the pandemic. But I'll add this: we should make things in Australia using the food and fibre that we produce in Australia. Labor's National Reconstruction Fund is designed to help drive this shift. The fund will provide loans, equity and guarantees to investors establishing new businesses or those recovering from the stress of the COVID pandemic. And today I announced that Labor will reserve $500 million of this funding within our National Reconstruction Fund, specifically for agriculture, forestry, fisheries, food and fibre. This will encourage investment in value-adding and growing exports. It will help diversify the sector and it will open up new possibilities for trade, and it will help create more jobs in the region. In addition, this commitment will support the sector as you prepare for a low-carbon future. I see a future in which we not only grow demand for bulk exports, but process more of that produce in regional centres where new businesses will add value for domestic sale, but also for export. Outside of agriculture, the National Reconstruction Fund will target new ventures in advanced manufacturing, the defence industry and renewable energy technology like wind turbines and electric batteries. The key to capitalising on these changes is understanding the importance of the shift to renewable energy, something that the current government has resisted for the last decade. Labor's vision is for a future made in Australia, a manufacturing revival, not just in the big cities, but particularly in the regions due to the nature of the shift that will happen. More manufacturing, more value adding, more jobs. I now turn to the NBN. One of the key responsibilities of any national government is to give people access to the communications connectivity that they need to compete in a fast-changing world. And that's why Labor's decision to establish a national broadband network rightly took a long-term view of the needs of Australians, regardless of where they lived or worked. It was about overcoming the tyranny of distance that historically we've spoken about in this vast island continent of ours. Our tyranny of distance from the rest of the world and from each other used to be a disadvantage. One way that we overcome that is through communications technology. The world's a smaller place these days. Our vision for the NBN was focused on building a better future, and it was about expanding opportunity. The fibre to the premise NBN model, one that I shifted on as communications minister in places like Nambucca and Coffs Harbour and parts of Queensland and Victoria, was about business, but it was also about giving Australian families the maximum benefits of the broadband age in areas like education and health. Yet at every step along the way, the Liberals and the Nationals opposed it. And they actually bought, with your money, 60,000 kilometres of copper wire instead in the 21st century. Enough to wrap around the world 1.5 times. In doing so, they denied 2 million premises in regional Australia access to world-class fibre connectivity, access they were going to get before 2013. Now, the cost of this second-rate NBN model has now blown out by at least $28 billion. So instead of doing it right, doing it once and doing it with fibre, the government is now starting a patch-up job, as they inevitably were going to do. Tragically, we'd seen the model of New Zealand. They'd gone down that track and they shifted to fibre back. The truth is that fibre's better than copper. It's like not rocket science, this stuff. A Labor government will do more. We've already announced our plans to ensure that 80% or 3.7 million homes and businesses in regional and remote Australia will have access to broadband speeds of 100 megabits per second or more by 2025. This includes expanded fibre connectivity to 660,000 premises, wireless speeds and upgrades benefiting 750,000 premises, as well as increased satellite data allowances. And today I am announcing that our Better Connectivity for Rural and Regional Australia plan. Now, this is a comprehensive targeted plan that will ensure better mobile coverage on roads, on farms and across regional communities, and better broadband as well. We'll commence an independent national audit of mobile coverage to identify mobile black spots and the places most in need of coverage upgrades. This will be delivered through an innovative partnership to place mobile signal measurement devices on Australia Post's transport assets. A great example of how we can leverage our public assets for public good. Labor will expand multi-carrier mobile coverage in regional homes and businesses, as well as along roads and along our highways, because we know and we've experienced it. In rural Australia, people often travel long distances and need to be connected for both convenience but also for safety. We will also invest in place-based connectivity programs for the regions, including better mobile voice and data coverage and targeted fibre upgrades in rural communities. And importantly, we will be expanding connectivity for farmers and enabling better wireless extensions on the field. This is critical to modern agriculture, as you know, making sure that Australian farms are as efficient and competitive as they can be. It will mean that many of you and farmers around Australia will be able to employ new sensor technology to monitor the health and movement of cattle on large stations, or identify metrics that determine the precise amount and types of fertiliser that are required for crops. There are many exciting developments in farming technology that can boost efficiency and productivity, but they aren't worth anything if you don't have access to reliable connectivity. There's no excuse for Australian farmers to be left behind because they can't access technology that would make their lives easier and improve their bottom line. Labor will make sure the connections you need are available. In addition, today I commit to boost funding for the innovative Regional Tech Hub, an excellent program managed by you, the NFF. Getting produce from paddock to plate or from shearing shed to ship requires first-class roads and rail to move it. Now, as many of you will know, I was the first infrastructure minister in Australia ever. My ministerial background included as well transport as well as communications, areas that are critical to your sector. If Labor is successful in next month's election, you'll find in me someone who understands the critical relationship between productivity-enhancing infrastructure and the success of your industries. I don't just talk about it, I understand it, and I have a record of delivery. I doubled the roads budget. Pacific Highway, $1.3 billion in 12 years under the Howard government, $7.9 billion under the 6 years in which I was minister. The Bruce Highway, 1.3, again, under the 12 years of the Howard government, 7.6 under myself as the minister. If you look at what we did right around the country, we completed the duplication of the Hume. We funded the Warrego, we did major upgrades to the New England highways right around the country, the Great Northern Highway in WA. We also built or rebuilt 4,000 kilometres of rail freight line, 1/3 of the interstate rail freight network, which brings me to the importance of getting it right when it comes to the Inland Rail project from Melbourne to Brisbane. Let's be clear, it was Labor with myself as the Minister who've put in $900 million for this project, the first real funding that was allocated, because we know some of the line went to straightening existing parts of the network. It made sure that that was done and so that it could project to the construction phase. But since then, there have been real issues. Now, my judgment at that time was that this was the type of project which, delivered properly, would underpin decades of economic prosperity and growth. The broad location in New South Wales, for example, the parks intermodal, was ideal because it connected up the north-south lines with the east-west lines. But nearly a decade later, it is clear that Inland Rail is not being delivered properly. As is the pattern of this government, they've always been there for the photo op, but often just not there for the follow-up. Despite dozens of media events and big announcements over what has been almost a decade, we have only 133 kilometres of new track in the middle of New South Wales. So 15 kilometres of new track for every year that this government has held office. I suspect that if you laid all of the government's media releases about Inland Rail in a row, the trail would extend further than the completed track. Now, the truth is that the route is not finalised. Not finalised in 2022. You all know that it doesn't actually terminate at the Port of Brisbane, but 38 kilometres away at Acacia Ridge. Now, when we talked about Inland Rail, we didn't mean literally inland. It's got to connect to a port. That's the whole idea of the project. Now, they've had almost a decade to get this right. Once again, big promises, little delivery. Instead of building the hype about Inland Rail, Labor will do the hard work to get this project back on track. We need to make sure that it's done and done properly. We also need to get serious about trade diversification, as you know. We know of the difficult situation with our exports to China. There is no doubt that our trade relationships have been affected by global political positioning as China has sought to aggressively assert its power. Now, there is no justification whatsoever for the trade restrictions that China has imposed on our exports, and Australia should never compromise on our values, and China must stop this coercion. It reminds us, though, of the need for us to seek out more trading partners, for us to be less dependent on any single market. Indonesia and India are clearly important priorities, but so are Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan, Singapore and South Korea. For several years, the government largely ignored the 2018 Varghese report, which it commissioned, that outlines a blueprint for how Australia can boost our trade with this rapidly growing nation of more than 1 billion people. India's share of exports dropped below 2%. That's the lowest level since 2003. The lowest level since 2003. Now, we welcome the recently announced trade deal with India, but it remains a partial deal driven by the election timetable, and we must do better. We also recognise the recent moves to refocus on follow-through on the Varghese report, but we are asking ourselves why it took so long. In light of the urgent need to diversify, precious years have been simply lost. Labor will support the agricultural sector to develop consistent codes around sustainability so that you can access and grow global markets, especially in Europe. Australia has some of the most sustainable farm practices in the world. It's a reputation that we should make the most of, as markets increasingly will look for clean and green products. It's an amazing advantage that we have. It should be a source of great national pride, and government should be working with you to maximise the economic benefit from it. Now, wherever I travel around Australia, employers tell me of their struggle to find workers. The closure of international borders due to COVID has, of course, exposed the full seriousness of our labour shortage by denying us access to overseas workers. Skills shortages have profound effects on your sector and right across the national economy. We will tackle the national skills shortage by funding 465,000 fee-free TAFE places and also 20,000 additional university places in areas that have skills shortages. We'll train up the next generation of builders, bricklayers and electricians, as well as nurses, aged care and child carers and engineers. But I know that skills shortages are also acute in rural and regional Australia, particularly in the farming sector. It's hard to find workers, from fruit pickers to shearers to agricultural scientists and wool classes. It is clear that the government's ag visa isn't working. The Nationals promised the ag visa would fix everything, but not one worker has arrived. None. Zip. Zero. The ag visa will be capped, of course, at 1,000 people a year. Now, that's far short of what you need in this sector. The Pacific Labour Schemes will remain the primary program for agricultural workers, but we must acknowledge that there have been problems with the treatment of workers by some farmers. Now, I know these are isolated cases, but bad eggs give the rest of the sector a bad name. And that's why I'll work with you to stamp out the exploitation of workers in the sector and to get the workers you need on farm. I know that my Shadow Minister, Julie Collins, has had really constructive discussions with you, and I thank her and Senator Raf Ciccone for their attendance here today. Beyond farm workers, skills shortages have a profound effect on the vitality of the regional communities that serve our agricultural producers. Whenever I see media reports about how cities lack enough teachers, doctors, nurses and aged care workers, I remind myself, and if not, I get lots of reminders, that it is far more difficult in regional Australia. And I think about how the quality of life of people in the regions is affected by labour shortages across the board, particularly in service areas like health, education and aged care. It's just one of the things that contribute to young people moving to the cities, is that lack of services. I grew up, as you probably know, in the city of Sydney, in Camperdown. But my cousins who are older than me, who lived at Halfway Creek, halfway between Grafton and Coffs Harbour, on 450 acres there, they, as soon as they left school, they came to my home in Camperdown because they couldn't get the services and what they needed in the local community. And I know from them and their friends that is heartbreaking for families in regional communities, particularly in your sector. We need to make sure that we ease labour shortages. This is critical if we want genuine decentralisation. That's in our national interest to have decentralisation. If we want people to stay in regional areas or to move them from capital cities, we have to train up enough Australians to undertake the careers that are so critical to the quality of life. And it's never going to be simple, but with 1.5 million Australians either unemployed or underemployed, that is, they want more work than they've got at the moment, we must get back into the business of skills training. It's not enough to say it's all too hard and just rely upon overseas workers on temporary visas. Labor will also give your industry a direct say in the nature of skills training. We'll create the independent Jobs and Skills Australia to work with industry unions and training providers to match the skills being taught with those that are actually needed by industry, not just today, but in the future. As the needs of industry change, the nature of training must also change. And the people who best understand these changes are the people who own businesses, including our farmers. Jobs and Skills Australia will be modelled on the Infrastructure Australia model, which I created in 2008 to bring an evidence-based approach to the assessment of proposed road and rail projects. Finding workers with the appropriate skills is one thing, but another challenge in regional Australia is housing them. We need to take action on regional housing. Last year, capital city housing prices climbed by 21%, but in the regions they jumped by 26%, and in some regions far more. Labor will create the Housing Australia Future Fund to build social and affordable housing now and into the future, including in regional centres. This will create jobs, build homes and change lives. But in addition, we will help 10,000 Australian families a year in regional areas to buy their first home. The Regional First Home Buyers Support Scheme will triple the number of places that Australians living in regional areas received last year under this government's existing program. Another key to quality of life in regional Australia is a properly resourced health system. Labor created our nation's universal health system, and we will always protect and back Medicare. And you can bank on a Labor government strengthening our Medicare system across the board, including by making it easier to see a doctor wherever you live. And I'll have more to say about that in coming weeks. People on the land understand the extremes of weather. Floods, cyclones and bushfires are part of your lives. But there is a role for governments to help communities with projects that mitigate the severity of natural disasters. Now, in 2019, we supported the creation of the $4 billion Emergency Response Fund. It took money that had been allocated for infrastructure under the former Labor government that had just been sitting there not being used because the funding had to go to projects that actually stacked up and were approved by Infrastructure Australia. And it set up a separate fund to invest in disaster relief and mitigation. But it has barely spent a cent from the fund. It treats it like a term deposit. It's now grown to $4.8 billion. The idea that you have a fund for disaster mitigation and for response and don't spend it over that period of time is just quite frankly mind-boggling. Well, we'll replace it with the Disaster Ready Fund. We will use that fund to invest up to $200 million a year on mitigation projects. There'll be projects that stack up, projects that make a difference. We'll do more than just hold a press conference about disaster mitigation. We'll get to work with real investment where it is needed. Let me finish with a very clear statement about my view of national leadership and the role of government in the life of our nation. I believe in the power of individual enterprise. I'm not a person who wants government to get in the way of businesses, but good governments facilitate market activity. I don't follow the approach, though, of those who I will be in a contest with soon, sometime. At some stage, they have to call this election. They seem to believe that if only governments would get out of the way, the market will sort everything out. I see a role for government in making it easier for businesses to succeed and to ensure that Australians get the services they need and the opportunity to get ahead. And I believe the path to achieving those aims is collaboration. I have that history. I created Regional Development Australia as a minister, creating regional bodies to advise on comparative economic advantage and where investment should go. I created the Australian Council of Local Government. Not all of my ministerial colleagues were wrapped with the idea of sitting down with 545 mayors every year for 2 days to discuss what was going on in local communities. But I did that. Our funding for local community infrastructure came from the bottom up. It came from councils, projects, including those in regional Australia. My model is collaboration. That's what I do, and you can believe that because that's what I've done. The current government, division, putting people against each other, doesn't lead us anywhere at all constructively. So if my team is successful in the upcoming election, you can be certain about one thing. I'll work with you, the National Farmers Federation, as I always have. I know that farmers and the NFF want what everybody else in this country wants, a better future. And I know you work damn hard in your sector to achieve that. I look forward to our ongoing engagement, and I thank you for having me to your conference today. Thank you.
Mr Albanese, thank you so much for that speech. In the interest of time, which we are a little bit pressed for, I just have one really, really simple yes or no answer question for you. If Labor forms government at the next election, will you scrap the ag visa?
Oh, we'll do something better. We'll sit down with you and work on how we get a proper visa system and how we get a proper workforce here. At the moment, there's an ag visa. If no one's come, guess what? It doesn't exist.
So is that a
It's
yes
not
or
real.
a no? You'll scrap the ag visa or you won't?
It's not real at the moment. It's just not real. We'll sit down with you and we'll have an appropriate system work through. We want to attract people here. The other thing that I think we need to do and to have collaboration on that I'm really interested in, if you have people who are coming here temporarily year after year after year and spending month after month after month here, why don't we give them a bit of certainty and actually allow people to stay who are making a contribution to the country? And I think that will make an enormous difference as well.
One to watch. Thank you. Ladies and
Thanks.
gentlemen, Anthony Albanese.